The final portion is a little bit mistitled. We've got their NANP committee members, but we're really interested in non-NANP people to give thoughts about what has happened today, thoughts about opportunities and possibilities for NAP. On the back cover of your brochure tells a little bit about some of our responsibilities again. So we've asked Dr. Todd Applegate at the University of Georgia. Todd is department head of the poultry science department. He was a poultry nutritionist at Purdue for many years, a well-respected nutritionist, and about 3 years ago moved into administration at Georgia. But we've asked him to guide this discussion, and it's wide open for any perspectives and thoughts that you have. So Todd?
Thank you, Merlin. I wanted to just take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers. If we could just please give them a big round of applause.
Before we leave, we'd like all the speakers up here. We want a picture of all you together. So don't run out the door after this discussion is done.
One of the things I'm going to do is kind of circle back on some of the comments that Merlin had earlier. So this is the second 5 years that we've been involved with this particular program. Over the past, the rewrite that we did 4 years ago now, we expanded our scope to include aquaculture, small ruminants, and horses. I know I was missing one. And that was purposeful. And part of where we were guided over the past 8 years has been somewhat purposeful based off of input that we've received from others. We're getting ready to go forward for an additional rewrite for this particular project. And so a number of you are either directly involved with NANP as members directly of the coordinating committee or on the subcommittees. And for our speakers, you were a little purposeful in inviting to give us your perspectives, because we have a lot of respect for your perspectives on where we have been and guiding towards where we may be going. So I'd like to kind of kick that off a little bit as the discussion, if we could, for the next little bit. I know a number of you have come a very long way, and there's been a number of different perspectives portrayed today across a number of things that we within animal nutrition touch, from environmental perspectives, societal perspectives, to then reacting, if you will, to how the public perceives what type of product and retailers, what type of product they want us to be producing within animal agriculture. So with that in mind, I'm going to open the floor, if you could, do a little bit of discussion as to give us some insights for us as our NANP program as we think about where we want to be going for the next 5-year plan, and help guide us at least into thoughts that we need to be doing from a research perspective as kind of a national coordinating group towards some of those efforts to facilitate some of those discussions, right? One of those that I think I put up earlier for Charles's discussion was we have this constant disconnect within and across scientific societies, right? Our disconnect as animal nutritionists as those with human nutrition. And we've had a number of those discussions within our group over the years, and how do we bridge that gap? I think we're looking for some tangible things to try to put forward to close that gap. If we look at some of the things that we've done, say, in the last 3 years on no antibiotics ever programs within the poultry sector, as well as moving into the swine sector, that really has changed very dramatically what we do. I think the other good example maybe from that is some of the One Health programs that have been put in place to bridge the veterinary community with that of the medical community. We still have even that gap between animal nutritionists and veterinarians in our own world. So if I could please open the floor. Things that you have learned directly today that might impact some ideas and thoughts. I'm going to call on Don, because Don's always a good words of wisdom, so to speak.
Okay.
Robin has.
I thought I would just go to the microphone. Oh, use the other one. Thanks, Todd. I thought, well, starting with the very first presentations this morning, so it's not just interfacing with one discipline, but obviously the whole problem of feeding the world is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and so that's difficult to achieve, even if you're just trying to bridge the gap between, say, nutritionists and veterinarians or animal nutritionists and human nutritionists. But I guess you got to start one-on-one. And one that I've often thought about and actually came up here today was talking to the plant science community about matching feedstuffs better with animal genetics, which some work has been done, but maybe in an initiative in that respect. Research priorities, perhaps, that would inform the funding agencies about where animal growth and metabolism could achieve efficiencies with plants that are engineered to be more bioavailable in terms of their nutrition or have better environmental footprints, for example. That's one suggestion.
Others?
Yeah, so I think I'll dovetail into that last comment, and that is one of the things I see is that, the public wants to know how their food is produced. But I also think that animal scientists don't really always understand how the crops that are raised for animals are grown, and how to take advantage of that, because in the life cycle assessments of animal ag, crop production, CO2, greenhouse gases, is being charged to the animal side. And so the animal side, I don't think, knows how to really take advantage all the time of how those crop production systems actually can help lower greenhouse gases for the animal industry.
I think kind of my only comment to both of those, it's very interesting as you look at the supply chain, right? Oftentimes we don't share a lot of that technological advancement and thought on technological advancement, partly because of how that chain has been developed. We've had a lot of conversations, say, on the soy side of that, and in part as the poultry being a huge consumer of total tonnage of soy, we have not been able to capture the economic benefit and gain to where we potentially could be, whether it be from reducing variation on a particular amino acid for meal coming out, or taking advantage of value-added traits, partly because of how that supply chain has been set up.
I thought the last presentation kind of brought me back to reality, because I've been thinking about, technology, and our workforce. Big thing I think we missed today is talking about workforce, that we in agriculture don't have a workforce and very limited. But we are looking at technologies to solve that solution. Dr. Vanderhaar talked about electronic feeding potentially for the cow. We're doing that with the sow. And, but he made a very good point. If consumers have this perception as a factory, so the more technology we put in to help with our labor components, we're losing the husbandry impacts. And then, we're going to be on that borderline of how do we face implementing technology to meet the demands of the future with ethics and values of, beliefs of humans of that's good husbandry. So I think that was an interesting wake-up call for me to say maybe it's good or bad opportunities there and how we approach technology use.
Oh. Well, I was just going to reflect a little bit on some of the changes that have happened as I've observed them. It seems like a few decades ago we were really emphasizing the redesigning of foods. And I know there are even some publications on redesigning X, Y, and Z. Pigs have been redesigned. We redesigned milk and changing fat content of milk available for consumers. Now I think we've entered into, well, stimulated by the FDA, providing large research grants on efficiencies, dairy efficiency, beef efficiency, swine efficiency research grants. We've had an emphasis on increasing the efficiency of converting feed to fuel or feed to food. Now it seems like one of the movements that we need to pay attention to, and it relates more to what John brought up, and that's crop production. We've got to reevaluate our use of land. Soil health is the big issue, and the nutrient runoff that we've allowed to happen has become a major issue. So there's an emerging discipline, if you will, of nutrient management of our soils, and I see that as an emphasis, and that relates to animal production as well, as we think about how we manage our precious land.
I think it's not only soil, but it's the contamination of water and other things that are really impacted by government policy, and I'm not sure where people are communicating. Here we are, we're producing a lot of product that comes from ethanol, and we're producing a lot of things that have nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's only one place for these items to go. They wind up in the environment. If you put 1 million tons of phosphorus on the ground 20 years in a row or whatever it is, then you've got 20 million and so on. So it's a complex interaction, I think. Typically, as I look at what has happened with the NRC publications, it's been a snapshot of where we are, and it describes exactly what has been done, and people can look at these references, and they're good for a few years, but then people move along, and it's well before the next publication. Now, what we're at and what we're talking about here to some extent today is one of the reasons for that, and Craig brought this out with poultry, that it's moving so fast. If you put a publication together, it would probably be out of date very quickly, unless you had a model that could predict where we should be. I guess that the idea is that we need to take a look at where we've been and where we're going to go. I guess that's the idea of the models. Does that make sense? I don't know. When I look at the composition and the growth of broilers and look at pigs and how they've changed in composition, what is it that we know today that can help us predict what a pig is going to be, like we heard today in terms of poultry, 20 or 30 or 40 years from now? So that's part of, I guess, what the modeling will be. I don't know. Is my understanding correct?
Excellent program. I think the committee did a wonderful job putting this together. For me, the comment of the day was in the hallway earlier, and that's, Clint, this is your comment. We are all approaching this with bias. We have a bias toward this. This is our life. This is what we like. We don't regulate our bias. Regulators don't really care about our bias. So what they regulate and what we would like to do may be different. We didn't address animal welfare. I talked to Dr. Kuhn outside. Animal welfare may very well slow down that chicken production. Very well could. I know. And it's, we have a bias to science. That's not what's happening. We have a bias to technology. That may not work. I think as we go forward, we have to put a consumer face on some of this, and really try to say, what is our end product? What are we trying to get to? And I mean, the whole concept of beef, of meat, is it meat? Is it not meat? I don't know. Maybe we move away. Can they call it beef? Can they call it bacon? I mean, what can they call it? I mean, maybe we have to move away from what our bias are into what the consumer actually wants or what the consumer dictates.
Thanks, Todd. I have a couple of comments, and I'm really puzzled, but I reiterate the comment. What a really interesting program this has been today, and it's been very thought-provoking and caused us to look at things and recognize our biases, of course. But Paul, in his presentation, and I know it was inadvertent because I know Paul really well, but if you look back at the pictures, the photos that he showed representing old-timey production versus modern production, his pictures, historical pictures, all showed animals in association with people. I don't think he had a single picture of animals without a person in that picture. But when he showed modern production, I don't think, and I might have been wrong, I might have missed, but I don't think he had a single picture of animals with a person. And that right away creates an image, a dynamic that differentiates between historical animal science and animal production and husbandry and modern production. And it fits the narrative that we face on an ongoing basis. And so it illustrated to me how I think animal agriculture has kind of lost the narrative, or control of the narrative, excuse me. And how do we get that control back, at least to some extent? Because when we look around us on a day-to-day basis, whoever controls the narrative is the one who gets their message out. And we try, some people try. Jen from Iowa Select that Paul referred to in his presentation, she does a marvelous job. And they have any number of activities in urban Iowa to explain what's going on in rural Iowa. I'll finish with a story very recently. I took my students to a 2,400 head pig barn, as I said earlier, a very typical pig barn. And the woman running it, it's a research barn. And my students asked her how she liked her job and so on. And she says, I grew up on a dairy farm. And when we ever sat down around the dinner table, it seemed like my parents were always worried about the weather, the price of corn, the price of other feed, the price of milk, the weather, the price of feed. She said, I didn't want a life of that. But now I come to work in the morning, I get a paycheck, and it doesn't matter what the price of corn is, what the price of feed is, what the price of pigs is. I have an income, and pretty much guaranteed. I go home at the end of the day, and I can spend time with my family. She said, I really like modern agriculture, right? And Paul did allude in his presentation about the impact of livestock on humans, as well as the impact of humans and the attitude of humans towards livestock. I have no solutions, and Don and Merlin, I like your question. I'm not going to be able to give you an answer, but somehow or other, we have to, farming in general has to somehow try to get some kind of at least engagement in the narrative, because we're not doing a very good job of that right now. Sorry, wish I had a better answer.
You stimulated a thought that I had earlier too, and that's more related to, as we were discussing potential cropping changes as an example. I think one of the things in rural America that we really face, there are a number of different issues as to how economies have changed in rural America, with opioid issues to, if you look at, we just had a summit in Georgia here in December, suicide rates for folks in rural communities are through the roof. It's very, very complex. And so back to Robin's comment too, I think it's very much a a very complex issue that we need to make sure that we do address and collaborate with those folks as we take things somewhat from a smaller scale to a broader perspective.
Is this on? So to your comment, John, I think I've been doing a research study at a really large dairy farm that has 15,000 cows, so 60 calves a day. They have the ability to have a full-time person there all the time. It's like a modern hospital with a great obstetrics wing, right? And every calf gets colostrum within 15 minutes of birth, and every cow is watched while she's calving. When I was a kid on a dairy farm, we found the calf the next morning, hoped it got colostrum. It might have been in the back pasture. Nobody was there to help care for it. If it was 10 degrees below zero, well, too bad. And but modern farms, they don't even want me taking a single picture on their place because they don't know how it will be used. But it's too bad we can't get that picture into people's minds a little bit about modern ag, because the big farms can do a great job. I think it's interesting that we call them factory farms, but we educate our kids in schools that are huge, and they do a lot of stuff on computers, and those aren't factory schools. I don't know. I guess the frustration for me is it seems like this is a little beyond the scope of us as nutritionists to deal with. I don't know what to do with it. I'm on the modeling committee for NANP. Is Mark still here? But what are we supposed to do? I mean, we can maybe come up with better systems, do more LCAs, do a better job of LCAs and include some nutrient management stuff, but I don't know how to deal with that. It seems beyond NANP.
And just referring back to my comment as I was thinking about it, I want to be really, really clear. Please don't think that I'm saying all we have to do is get our message out. We're really great. We're doing everything the way it needs to be done, and we don't need to change. We just need to tell a story. We need to change. My concern really is that if we're going to change, and we do need to change, let's make sure we change for the right reasons and do the right things rather than change because there's some forces out there that can swing and change pretty quickly, and we can go chasing them and get into trouble. So please understand my comment. Yes, we do need to get involved in the narrative and how we do it. I'm like you, I don't have an answer, but please understand, I agree, we do need to change. We hear that all the time.
I had a couple of reflections on animal welfare, and going back to something I said in my talk, that the social scientists in our group, when they look at what is changing the attitudes of especially millennials today to livestock, it keeps coming back to some of the issues that we heard in the last talk about animal welfare. And just reflecting what you said a few moments ago, I think an area where the industry is losing the argument is about just how high animal welfare can be in more intensive production facilities. And we all know production facilities that can be bad for welfare, and we all know extensive facilities which can be bad. But there is an equation of sort of intensive, and again, a pejorative term, factory farm, with poor welfare, which doesn't reflect reality. If you go out there and use sort of objective measures of animal welfare, or if you just go out and just look at how the cows are. So I don't know how one changes that, but I think the livestock industry and anyone cares about food security needs to address that. I think another area we're coming in welfare, and this reflects some of the issues about chicken rearing, is that the power of natural selection is you can do quite extraordinary things to animals, and a narrow focus on just productivity gains can be very counterproductive when it gets into public discourses. And we've seen this with some of the breeds of cattle which have got a lot of muscle on them but have lots of other pathologies to them. And as someone who's an enormous fan of what can be done by breeding, then I think getting the criteria right, yes, you want to increase productivity, but you have to look at other things, including welfare. And sometimes you can get quite unexpected win-wins when you are breeding for animals that in some sense, and I'm thinking now more of poultry, that have pretty good in productivity, maybe not as high as you can get, but also have good welfare standards. And when you sort of do the look at the productivity per shed, not the productivity but per bird, you can get some pretty good figures out of that. So I think one has to think about the public perception of the welfare of the animals.
So I would just echo the comments with regard to the committee. Great job, really comprehensive set of talks, a lot of really good information. And so I don't want to beat the dead horse, if I can say that. It's an animal-friendly group, right? Use slang, but we as scientists, we can do the genetics. We can study that interaction with the environment and with our management protocols very well. We're equipped to do that. We're trained to do that. The S component in the G by M by E by S is more of a challenge to us as we're hearing. But indeed, it's probably the most relevant component of our sustainability, and one that we should not ignore going forward for sure. And so what we need is a lot more Pauls, right? We need a lot more sociologists that understand animal production, understand our history, and why we have evolved our production systems to where they are today. So I would argue that our modern day animal production systems have evolved with welfare measures in mind. We just didn't measure it and didn't tell the story because we didn't see the need to as we've evolved our industries over the last 50 years. So now at the same time, we've had this disconnect, as he eloquently described, with generations removed from animal production and really humanizing food animals and not really understanding our production systems, the biological responses that those animals have to stress, all those things, right, that we should have been measuring along the way but didn't see the need to do so. So somehow then telling that story, engaging those millennials in production and modern day production practices, opening our farms and ranches so they can see what we do and why we do it is going to be critical to sustainability of livestock in the future. So again, I don't really have the answers other than engaging sociologists that have that skill set is going to be critically important to us in the future.
I think that's right. It works? This works. Can you hear me okay? Okay. You know, John, Clint, I think that's right. We spent a couple $100,000 as a corporation trying to figure out how to tell that story. 35 to 45-year-old, female, professional, scientist, mother. That's who relates best to our story. How we put that in play. We went out and hired somebody for that very reason, to tell our side of the story. But to relate to millennials, that's what it's going to take. So Robin, you got a great future. You know. That's right. Yeah.
So I guess I would highlight, when you say millennial, I'm included in that generation, as are many of your graduate students, right? Talking, using kind of our historical approach of let's get somebody from a different discipline cross-trained in animal science to address these challenges hasn't worked historically. So why would it work for this challenge? It needs to go both directions. I think we need to be focusing on cross-training our graduate students and being able to communicate with their peers about some of these really critical challenges. That means maybe taking time away from research, which is a really scary thing, right? But giving them the opportunity to get trained in how to communicate
about these types of issues. Because if we don't start doing it, Mike, I would challenge you that nobody's going to do it for us. So we as an industry need to change so that we're communicating our story, because nobody can do it better as long as we're equipped with the right tools. So I think that a focus on graduate education is probably very timely.
Any other comments?
Thank you. I was just going to comment on the training of graduate students. That's become a little bit more specialized because more graduate students are paid on research grants, and how are you going to get that next grant funded? You better make sure that graduate student works only on that particular grant, probably takes fewer coursework for courses than, say, 25 years ago, which I think is pretty true at our place. How do we train our graduate students in what you're saying? I'm not disagreeing, but that's a real challenge as I observe the way graduate students are paid to do their training. It's more focused and less emphasis on things not involved in their research.
They're willing to do it outside of their work. So workshops and things like that are a great start.
And I would argue, John, that if you train your students, you start training your graduate students in how to communicate better, that includes written communication, they can help you get that next grant, right? They can write a compelling case because you have to explain to all, including the National Science Foundation, what your relevance to society is, and how you're going to try to impact that through your work. So I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing to try to make an effort to do. They're grad students. They work more than, when I was a graduate student, I certainly was expected to do those kinds of things.
I would say that, I've kind of worked all over the world and talked to, animal scientists, non-animal scientists, and I think people are very open-minded about animal science and agriculture, but I heard the term bias a lot, and we kind of try to push science down people's throats, and I work with a lot of colleagues that don't have animal science background, and by exposing them to what we do and why we do things. I mean, a lot of times this is the result, this is why but we don't explain why. And I notice as I talk to different people, either in the community or even in my industry or in my company, that I'm probably one of the last generations of somebody who grew up and worked on a farm, who I've actually seen swine production from raising them outdoors to going indoors and why. And that's going to be lost with my generation. And I'm an exception. I'm not the normal thing. And I think, we have to try to bridge that gap, and we have to know when to fight and when not to fight. And sometimes, we fight at the wrong times, and we interject our opinions or our bias at the wrong times. And I think, I don't know how you train that and help with that, but I came in here with a bias. I have a little less bias. Thank you, Dr. Godfrey, for that. On, the Lancet report, I think there's really valid stuff, and I think maybe we need to have open dialogues and not be concerned with criticism as much and find common grounds, because we all have great ideas, but I think a lot of times we get stuck on our boundaries, and we need to have more open discussions of how we can, especially sustainability, food production, how can we take the concerns of our consumers into what we do? And maybe we already are, they just don't realize it. And, we like to tell our story with numbers and facts, and, there's lots of opportunities left.
Well, I'm going to turn it here in a second to Merlin. I wanted to reflect back on a couple of other things. One was a very interesting term that Charles used this morning, was pornography of doom. I I love that. I'm going to use that again. And I think we are talking a little bit about that worst case scenario. And I do have some optimism, at least I think, with the next generation of grad students. They do operate differently, and it's figuring out how to properly challenge them and present the challenge in front of them. I've been amazed at some of the things that we've changed in the past even 5 years. And I wouldn't have expected, 50% of the broiler production to now be NAE or more just in the last 3 years. Companies have adapted to that. I see optimism, at least on, say, the modeling side and how we're adapting to use of AI systems. That's entering into ag and ag space very quickly. My wife and I had the realization that we are probably training the last generation to learn how to drive, which is really scary. I want my kids to have that fear and trepidation that I have. But it is amazing. I think we do have a lot of optimism in where we're going with the next generation. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Merlin. I did want to plant some seeds, partly as you go and ruminate, reflect on today's program and who we are as our NANP program, and thoughts that you'd like to relay to us to think about as we put forward the next writing of the next 5-year plan. Please do send those. I'll let Merlin be the key point towards that, to direct it to him, if you could. I didn't think he wanted that, but I'm giving it to you. So with that, Merlin, thank you.
Well, we have got some ideas, and the NANP committee is meeting tomorrow morning to, while things are still fresh in our mind, to talk through some things that have been said here. I wrote some things down, even as Jerry, you just mentioned about NRCs being a snapshot, and I don't know if you mentioned Craig's comment or whatever, but this whole thing about net energy for maintenance and then increased gain, and it just points to the importance of our modeling committee. And it is so critical that we have the modeling for between the NRCs. And so some of the things that come out of this aren't new things, but just, yeah, it's important what we're doing. I do wonder if we need to add a sociologist or somebody on ag communications to the committee. I don't know. We'll talk about it. I was really blown away by how little we know about fish. And man, Robin, I'd move up that NRC for revision for fish. I mean, aquaculture's got to be a part of the future. So there's been things that come out and that I've written down, and as Todd said, communicate with any of us, because this is the revision project is a few months down the road, and we'll be working on that. But we'll be putting documents together from this meeting, just a short, as we think right now, probably a 1-pager, a 10-pager like we did before, and it's on our website, and it's a variety of things that we'll be putting together. So thank you, speakers, for that. Do want to remind the speakers, if you'd come up here, we'd like to get a picture. Other than that, thank you very much for the time that you spent. Speakers, for more time that you spent than the rest of us. I do appreciate I grew cross-species wise. I grew in terms of cross-disciplinary wise. Thank you for coming, Charles. It's a long trip. Really appreciate that. So anyway, with that, we'll call this meeting adjourned. And thank you very much for your time, and all the best in your efforts in animal agriculture for the future. Thank you.